Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, Westerns, I'm going to do a comparative review of Riders of the Purple Sage by Zane Grey and Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. So these were the first two books that I've read for June on the Range, which is the fantastic Western reading event created by Michael K. Vaughan and co-hosted by me and a bunch of other booktubers who I will try to remember to link to in the description for this. And I have not read a lot of Westerns in my life. I've read the Edge, and people who watch the channel regularly will know that I've been reading the Edge books since I started the channel and enjoying those. But I've not read many traditional westerns. So the Edge books are what are referred to as Piccadilly westerns, in that they were, kind of cheap British rip-off westerns, basically. So I was really keen to get into reading some real westerns, if you like, as part of June on the Range, and thought I would start with Riders of the Purple Sage by Zane Grey, which is considered often quoted as being a really formative book in the genre, in terms of creating lots of the tropes and things like that became a really popular part of the Western genre. So I read that, and then I read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which was the Berthier book club choice for this month. So originally chosen by Fraser Simons at Springboard Thought as his favourite book from his birth year. Whereas Riders of the Purple Sage is considered one of the first, westerns, Blood Meridian is a modern western, and deliberately very, very different from a kind of traditional western. So Riders of the Purple Sage was first published, I think, in 1912. So, not long after the end of, what is considered the Wild West era. I can't remember exactly when it is, but it's kind of, mid-1800s to the beginning of the 1900s, isn't it? So this was published, hot on the heels of that. In fact, probably, in some parts of America, it still felt like the Wild West. Whereas Blood Meridian was, 1985. So really, after the Western as a genre had pretty much died out, Cormac McCarthy came along and started writing these very different kind of literary types of westerns. So let me talk quickly about the plots for the two books, and then I'll talk about my impressions of them and what I think the key differences are. So Riders of the Purple Sage surprised me in the beginning of it is all about Mormons, which I wasn't expecting at all. So it's set in Utah, and it focuses or centres on these three characters, really. So there's a who live on the outskirts of kind of a Mormon community. So there's a woman who is a Mormon. There's a young man who's a Gentile, as the Mormons refer to them, so non-Mormon, who she's like hired to be a hired hand. And then there's this kind of mysterious gunfighter type character who turns up as well. And the Mormons are presented in this as being, really an oppressive society, and they've frowned deeply on the fact that this woman, who's one of their own, has taken this hired hand who isn't a Mormon. And there are things that the Mormons are said to have done, and the Mormon characters have done in the past, which are shady, and that's where this gunfighter comes in. There are, links between him and other characters who are mentioned, and he's basically there to get revenge. I won't go more into the plot than that, really, because I think it would spoil it. But it's definitely got all of the elements that you would expect from a classic western. So it's got kind of rustling scenes. It's got shootouts. It's got it's got people going off into the desert and being thirsty and stuff like that. It's got lots of descriptions of purple sage, which seems to grow everywhere in Utah. I don't really know what sage is, I'll be honest with you. I know, is it the same sage that you have in sage and onion stuffing? I assume so. Anyway, so there's all that stuff. There's loads of horses, and the characters feel quite archetypal in that you've got this the young guy who kind of comes of age really as the book progresses, and becomes a man, and then you've got this kind of bitter old gunfighter character who's after revenge, and then you've got this overpowering kind of leader of the Mormons, who's kind of like that kind of cattle baron type character who just wants to get all the land and all the power and, you know, drive the smaller homesteaders out and that kind of thing. And it builds up to a really enjoyable climax, and I just loved it. It's got a lovely sense of place. Zane Grey describes like the countryside and things like that beautifully, and you really feel like you are experiencing the Utah desert. And the characters are really fun as well. It's intensely melodramatic at times, but really enjoyable for that. I really enjoyed that side of it, and whilst it doesn't feel realistic, it was a lot of fun to read. Blood Meridian, on the other hand, whilst also excellent, is not fun to read in any way, shape or form. So it's about this young guy who's called the Kid, and there's kind of a bit of a coming of age element to Blood Meridian as well, who is kind of bumming around the States basically and getting into trouble, and ends up hooking up with this group of people who are led by this strange character called the Judge, who are going down to Mexico to hunt Native Americans and scalp them, because there's a scalp bounty going on. So the more scalps they can get, the more money they make basically. And it is a bleak and brutal book. It's incredibly violent, and it doesn't shy away from violence at all. So there is no one who is safe from the violence in this book. Men are killed, women are killed, children are killed, babies are killed. It's really horrific, and it is completely unflinching in its violence, but convincing in its violence as well. There's an absolutely breathtaking, the first kind of big scene of violence happens at the end of the 4th chapter, and it is just breathtaking. It's so immersive and convincing. And I I did a video a while ago about Cormac McCarthy's book All Pretty Horses, and I was pretty hard on that book. And one of the things I criticised is Cormac McCarthy's repetitive style. So he does this thing, and I forget what it's called as a technique, where he just basically makes lists of things, where he says this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. And he does that in Blood Meridian, but he does it to fantastic effect, because he does it typically for these scenes of violence where it just feels like it's ramping up and ramping up and ramping up, and it gets more and more horrifying the further he goes. So you get these massive long sentences which are just completely compelling and completely horrific. So I thought Blood Meridian was a much better book than All the Pretty Horses. I didn't get on with All the Pretty Horses at all, but Blood Meridian I thought was excellent. And really it's that the difference in the treatment of violence that is, the main difference between these two books. So Rise of the Purple Sage, I would say, has a much more hopeful outlook. So it's about freedom, and it's about breaking away from oppression, and that is a very much part of the American dream, isn't it? It's being able to have your own land and be safe, and fight off oppressors and things like that. Whereas Blood Meridian is just a horrible book about war and the atrocities of war. And whereas in Rise of the Purple Sage, violence is often a good thing, in that it frees the characters and it gets resolution, and it helps them defeat the people that are against them. In Blood Meridian, violence is always an awful thing. And one of the things that's interesting is, whereas Blood Meridian goes out of its way to be as descriptive as possible about the violence, Rise of the Purple Sage does the opposite. So whilst there are gunfights and things like that in them, you often don't see them at all. So you often hear about the gunfight after it's happened. You get a character retelling what has happened. So telling you about the gunfight and what happened and who won and stuff like that, which is an interesting technique and does sap the tension a bit from the gunfights, because you only find out afterwards what's happened, so you can't know who came out on top. It's an interesting approach to violence. I've seen it before in So it's something that Patrick O'Brian does in his naval adventure book. Sometimes is you'll get this big build up to a sea battle, and then he cuts to after the battle and the characters discussing what happened. So it's an interesting way of doing it, and it works. It works in Rise of the Purple Sage, and there's no lack of thrills and tension in the book despite that technique. Whereas Blood Meridian there is tension there, but it's more like the tension of watching a car crash or something like that. It's really horrible. The other thing that I think is kind of similar between the two books is the kind of central antagonist characters. So you've got the Mormon guy who's I forget his name in the book, but I think he has. I think he's called the something, similar to the judge in Blood Meridian. So they are both these really powerful men who have people kind of under their sway and seem to be able to convince people of anything in order to get their way. The judge in Blood Meridian is a fantastic character, just completely overwhelmingly powerful to the extent that he almost feels kind of inhuman at times. Or more than human, superhuman, as well as being inhuman in the violence that he metes out. And the central kind of villain in Rise of the Purple Sage is similar, and he seems to really have this power over his followers. But yeah, very, very different books, a very different take on the Western. And I think that Blood Meridian clearly came at a time when America was coming to terms with some of the atrocities that have been committed as part of the Wild West era and the war against the Native American tribes and things like that. So America starting to feel that guilt about the things that have been done in the name of freedom, whereas Rise of the Purple Sage is very much romanticising that kind of thing. So yeah, very interesting. Let me know if you've read them, what you think of them and what you think of the differences between the two books. I thought both of them were excellent. I gave both of them 5 stars. I really enjoyed reading both. But yeah, completely different. They could all be more different takes on a genre. So yes, as always, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you found it interesting. Hope you're safe and well. Hope you read really good stuff. And I will speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.